Our last makeup lecture will cover Baroque France, and we've already begun to look at some French artists from the Baroque period, those ones who had gone to Italy and had seen different works by Caravaggio and were very much inspired by those works. These artists, like Vouet and Valentin de Boulogne, helped to translate the style of Caravaggio back to France. And we find back in France a number of artists who very much were influenced by Caravaggio, but secondhand via these other Caravaggisti who had worked their way back to France and spread Caravaggio's style there. The most famous of the French Caravaggisti is Georges de la Tour. And unlike Vouet and Bologna, he never went to Italy. He never saw a Caravaggio painting firsthand. He got his Caravaggio style secondhand. He got it via works by other artists like Vouet, like Bologna. And on a certain level, it's a particularly unique take on Caravaggio. It's a very personal take on Caravaggio. One of the things Delatour does that Caravaggio and most of his followers rarely do is he puts the light source actually in the painting. So here, Mary Magdalene, we've seen images of Mary Magdalene before. She's at the moment where she's repenting. Again, that high Baroque drama. She's thinking about her past and pondering what Christ has said to her and thinking about converting and giving up her sinful ways and becoming a follower of Christ. And she's doing this in the dark of the night. And unlike Caravaggio, who loves to give us the revelation of God shining down on them from above, what Delatour does is to show her thinking by candlelight and including the candle, or almost including the candle, in the scene itself. It's there. We see the tip of it, but we don't actually see the candle itself. It's directly behind that skull that she has her hand on. So here is our Magdalene. And you'll notice that what she's doing, this is such a wonderful picture. She's staring at her reflection in the mirror. And again, the mirror is this strong metaphor for self-reflection. She's looking at herself and she's thinking about uh, what life means and the choices she can make that could maybe make her life better. And what Delatour has done is to cock the mirror a little bit so that as we look at it, we see in the reflection in the mirror the skull that's on the board next to her. So we, in many ways, become like the Magdalene. We are meant to be just exactly like Mary Magdalene. And we should think about death and ponder our own mortality. And in doing so, think about what's important in life and what choices we're making. She is for us this incredibly strong role model, an important figure for the Counter Reformation. Most Baroque art in France, however, was a lot less dramatic and totally devoid of any Caravaggio influence. Nicolas Poussin is perhaps the most famous French Baroque artist, and as we look at this picture from Richmond, from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, we see absolutely no energetic movement. We see no strong, dramatic diagonals. We see no theatrical lighting. Instead, everything is clear and crisp and colorful, but not like a Rubens even, where that clear, crisp color adds to theatricality, adds to drama. Poussin is staid. It's without any kind of movement whatsoever. It's almost timeless and frozen. And this particular style is kind of a return to the sort of timelessness of the Renaissance. Everything controlled by geometry. The placement of the figures become pyramids and a series of verticals and horizontals that lock the composition in. We refer to this style as classicism because it's returning to sort of the classical art of antiquity, the classical art of the Renaissance. And in many ways, and this is, by the way, the dominant style in 17th century France, this is a reaction against the more flamboyant, uh, more esoteric art of the Mannerist period. It's a clear and clean, legible, and undramatic style from the 17th century. So in many ways, we've talked again and again about how artists often react against the style of their fathers, and sometimes even turn back to the style of their grandfathers to do so. That's exactly the case with Nicolas Poussin. He's reacting against mannerism of the 16th century, late 16th century, and really kind of looking back toward this sort of classicism of the high Renaissance. Now, there's also a particular reason why he was doing this. There's a motivation for Poussin's classicism, and that motivation came from the King of France himself, Louis the 14th. Louis founded in 1648 the French Royal Academy, the Académie Royale Française. And the point of the Royal Academy that Louis the 14th had founded was to train artists to make works of art for him and for his court, and in particular that he could choose from them the best artists to make official state art that would be given as gifts to diplomats, art that would decorate his palace at Versailles. And he particularly wanted these works to be very, very clear, very clean, very classical in the Italian Renaissance style. And this was, in fact, the style that in the 17th century was the most dominant style taught at the French Royal Academy. So artists in France were much more imbued with a more sedate kind of style than the art that we've seen elsewhere in Europe in the Baroque period. And Poussin, as I said, is the best proponent of this classicism in French Baroque art. Poussin preferred these carefully organized and tightly rendered, tightly structured scenes, and this was a direct result from the ways in which Poussin worked. He had an incredibly methodical working practice, which was a hallmark of classicism. He would sketch out the composition, both in whole and in various details, doing studies of feet and hands and costumes and drapery, and bringing that all together into the final composition. But one of the things that Poussin did that was unique to Poussin, and I think this is on one of the worksheets, is that he would make stage sets based on those compositions. He would make little lit boxes where he would set up wax and clay figures, sometimes nude and sometimes in costumes, sometimes both. And after having sketched things out and arranged it and lit the scene, he would then make sketches from his little modellos that he had made for a second set of preparatory drawings that would then lead to the final composition. And he would move them around after he saw them in 3 dimensions. And so we have to think of our painting of Achilles on Skyros as a final painting that went through all of these different steps, each of which tends to sort of make it more dry, a little bit less vibrant. There's no interest in spontaneity here whatsoever. Sketched it out first, details and the entire composition, then made this little box model with figurines, then sketched that for the final composition. And that adds to his overall sense of classicism. Now, what's the story at hand here? It's a classical mythology, which again, remember that history paintings were seen as the most valuable kind of paintings in the 17th century. Achilles, the great warrior, his mother had been warned that he would die in the Trojan War. She had been told by, I think, the oracle at Delphi had predicted the future, told her that Achilles would die. And so she decides to try to save him. And what she does is she comes up with this scheme by hiding him. And she sends him to an island, Skyros, where only women live. and she dresses him up as a woman to live among women on the island of Skyros. And this will hide him from any kind of military duty. Well, Ulysses learns about her plot and decides he's going to trap Achilles. And we see the moment of entrapment. So it's this Baroque interest in a moment of revelation. But again, the sense of drama is nowhere near as heightened as what we've seen in other artists. Achilles' trap, which is kind of funny in its way, is he brings a bunch of gifts to the island of Skyros. And it's boxes full of jewelry. And he plants inside the box with the jewelry a sword and a helmet and a shield, military armor. And at the moment the box is opened, all the women dive in, grab these jewels, grab earrings, necklaces, and Achilles, hiding as a woman, immediately grabs the military gear and puts it on. And so while they are vain and looking at their jewels, they're sort of appealing to their vanity, it also appeals to his vanity because he can't wait to put that helmet on and see what he looks like dressed up as a soldier. And this reveals him now to be the great soldier in drag, the great soldier hiding out amongst the women. And he's from this point conscripted to go off to the Great War, the Trojan War, and eventually die in battle. The other great classical artist from 17th century France was Claude Lorrain. He's named after the region he's from, Lorraine, which was independent from France at this point, but sort of a satellite, if you will, under the Directorate of France. Both Claude and Nicolas Poussin spent the vast majority of their careers working and living in Rome. Part of the reason for this was that France was embroiled in its own war, and times at home were difficult. But also there was a great interest in Italian Renaissance art, ancient Roman art, and for Claude and Nicolas Poussin, both of these paintings certainly reflect their interest in classical antiquity, part of the classicism that is 17th century French art. Now, Claude is different from Poussin in that, and you can see this quite easily from looking at them, his subject matter, his narrative, is placed into a landscape that takes up most of the interest of the scene. So we have the figures in the lower left corner, but they're much smaller compared to the overall composition than Poussin's are. Poussin's is a figure painting. It's a history painting. Claude's is a landscape painting that just happens to have figures in it. But the landscape seems to take up the majority of his interest. And this is typical for Claude. He loves landscape images with small figures, and the landscapes tend to be fairly conventional. And by that I mean he follows a particular convention for all of them. He loves these vistas that open to a distant horizon over water with very heavy, humid air, evening sort of light that dapples through the landscape, usually falling low across the horizon. I think on a certain level he's influenced by Titian and Giorgione, even though it doesn't look anything like a Titian or a Giorgione. The air is much more crisp, the edges more sharp. That's much more classical than Titian or Giorgione would ever paint. But he loves this sort of framing device where you get sort of dark trees that we look in through and around to a more brightly lit horizon, whether it's morning or night, and then pools of light falling across the figures in the shadowy foreground and picking out the important ones for us to see. In this particular case, it's again a scene from mythology. Paris is a shepherd. According to Greek mythology, he's in Troy, the city of Troy, just before the Trojan War. And he is offered the opportunity to choose between three goddesses, each of whom will try to persuade him to choose her as the primary goddess, the most important goddess. So each of them offers him a gift. Minerva offers him victory in war, and she is shown here with a helmet and a spear. Uh, Juno offers him to make him the ruler of the world, and she points towards the heavens. She's accompanied by a peacock, which is her symbol. The third goddess is Venus, the goddess of love, and she appears naked, following the basic pose we saw in Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and accompanied by Cupid at her side. And Venus doesn't offer him herself, her own beauty, but she offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, if you will choose her. And the most beautiful woman in the world is the princess of Sparta, the enemy of Troy. And her name is Helen. And he chooses Venus. Venus gives him Helen. And as he takes Helen to be his own, this is the face that launched 1,000 ships. This is the beginning of the Trojan War. So Paris here is at a moment of decision, like so many of our Baroque figures, at a moment of tumultuous decision, even though it's so calm and staid in the way that he depicts it. He's going to choose Venus, and this will start the Trojan War. The art of the 18th century in France goes in an entirely different direction. I mean, you can see some of the influence of Claude Lorrain with the trees capturing the foreground, the figures arranged in that foreground, opening to a more brightly lit horizon over an expanse of water in the background, but it's painted entirely differently. Much more frivolous looking. The colors are more pastel. No deep dark blacks. Everything has a sort of soft quality to it. That's really very, very different from Claude Lorrain or even Poussin's classicism of the 17th century. So again, a reaction as we move into the 18th century, where French painters react against the style of their fathers, giving us something very much different than Claude or Poussin. And the basic subject matter, the basic theme here is a theme of amorous adventure. Everyone here is hooking up. The more you look at the composition, the more you realize it's a set of pairs of lovers. The three figures on the hill in the foreground, we see two of them in the detail here, the three pairs of figures. Each of them is setting up this grouping of aristocrats in love. And you can see that all of them are incredibly finely dressed. You would never mistake this for a Dutch picture. The people are way too elegant, way too refined, the clothing over the top. As we look further down the hill, no one is left alone. Everybody pairs up. And they're all, upper middle class or even upper class citizenry, as we can tell from their clothing. That they are the wealthiest of the wealthy. They're the We call this changed style of 18th century French Rococo, in order to distinguish it from the classicism of French Baroque art. And this new style, this new Rococo, actually seems to coincide almost exactly with the change in leadership in France. The classical style of Claude Lorrain, of Nicolas Poussin, we had talked about being directly indebted to King Louis XIV, who wanted classical art for the artists who worked for him. He dies in 1714 and is succeeded by Louis XV, who takes the throne in 1715. And the fascinating thing that happens with Louis XV is that all the aristocrats who had grouped themselves around the king under Louis XIV had been living in Versailles outside of Paris, where Louis XIV had his palace. Louis XV returns the royal residence to the city of Paris. And what follows him are all of these aristocrats coming back from Versailles. And they're commissioning new works of art to decorate their palaces in and around Paris. And what they want from these pictures are images that relate to their lives, images that relate to them, and very decorative images to adorn these palaces in and around Paris. Watteau's Return from Cythera is exactly one of these kinds of pictures, meant to decorate the aristocratic palaces in Paris during a period when the aristocrats are moving back from Versailles, returning to Paris and building new chateaus uh, to meet their opulent lifestyle. Now, this new style is very much indebted to the past. It seems to revert back to the sort of uh, over the top opulence of Rubens. And in fact, when we look at records of the French Royal Academy in the 18th century, artists actually called themselves Rubenists, in distinction to the followers of Poussin, who called themselves Poussinists. So we have a change here of taste from the classicism of Poussin to the more opulent style of Rubens. This is typical of the 18th century. Now, the subject matter of this work by Watteau, which is a new kind of work, really, love in the out of doors. Cythera is an ancient Greek island coming out of Greek mythology. And you can see that Watteau doesn't care about that. It doesn't look anything like ancient Greece at all. There's nothing here that looks even vaguely Mediterranean. But according to mythology, this island in Greece was ruled by the goddess Venus. And so Watteau includes Venus in statue form off to the right, with flowers adorning her statue. And you can see at the base of the statue a little quiver with arrows and a bow there. Cupid is sitting down below. He has finished his work. There he is, sitting on other arrows as well. His work here is done. He has gotten all of these aristocrats who've come to Cythera to fall in love. And now he's just sort of watching how it all pans out. And they're about to return to society from this island. And we can see that the boat that's going to take them back is a boat surrounded by mythological figures and more little Cupid figures in the air behind them, even a dog rearing up to look into the boat. This is really just frivolous aristocratic love in the garden, and this becomes really the single most dominant theme in Rococo art. Are these images of aristocrats at play, and usually in the great out of doors. Francois Boucher presents us another image of love in the out of doors, and you can see by looking at the style of the landscape in each of these, they have that incredibly strong, hazy atmosphere as we look through the trees to the background, almost obscuring everything. It's not Leonardo, it's not Sfumato by any means. It's just this sort of verdant, opulent heaviness to the air. And in this case, instead of seeing aristocrats in love, we see the goddess of love herself, Venus, bathing herself in the out of doors, with Cupid, her son, immediately next to her. More of Cupid's pals, what we call eroti, looking at her, pointing toward her, and she's displayed for us as if we sort of catch her unawares. The sense of eroticism is very, very strong in Rococo art, and certainly the idea of Venus as the goddess of love is picked up very much by the two doves that have their feathers all aflutter as they become attracted to each other. This was again one of these decorations for one of the new chateaus around Paris, and it was painted as a pair of pictures, what we call pendants, meant to be hung immediately next to each other, each about 4 feet tall. And here we see Venus in the indoors, again at her bath. In this case, again surrounded by those characters. These two works were made to decorate, like I said, the palace of one of these new chateaus around Paris as Louis XV moved his court back to Paris. The original owner of these two works was, in fact, the chief mistress to Louis XV. He had quite a few lovers. Madame de Pompadour, whose name might be familiar to you from style magazines and whatnot. A pompadour is a hairstyle. She was the primary mistress to uh, uh, Louis XV, and these were for her country retreat outside of Paris. This pair of pictures were also painted as pendants to be hung next to each other in one of these country estates outside of Paris. And like all of our other Rococo pictures that we've looked at, they are also very much focusing on aristocratic love in the garden, both allegories for love, showing games being played as metaphors for the courtship ritual, right? In Blind Man's Bluff on your right, we see the woman blindfolded looking for people as she reaches out around. This, of course, is intended as an allegory for courtship, how one looks for a lover. And we find more people around as we look at the picture more closely, hiding in the bushes or at a feast table in the right corner. And the opposite side, the other image, shows a woman on a swing that's being put in motion by a man behind her. And certainly this theme of swinging is a metaphor for erotic ecstasy. She's been put in motion, flying through the air by love itself. But again, surrounded by other images of frivolous activity. The man with the woman who wears a very, very low cut top, bathing the little puppy in the fountain behind them. Not all Rococo era art, however, depicted these sort of frivolous love scenes. In fact, some of them are much more humble looking and might even remind us of Dutch Baroque art. Like these Dutch Baroque images, they seem to focus on the virtue of work around the house as a sign of diligence, and that diligence as a sign of virtue, good, honest work. Even though our nurse, probably the nurse of an invalid preparing the meal for someone who is bedridden, is intent on her duties, and we see her sort of humble but respectful life, it's important to remember that the people who bought images by Chardin would have been the same aristocrats to decorate their households that bought the more flamboyant Rococo scenes of love in the garden. But we can see that in all of Chardin's, and this is really what he specialized in, all of his scenes of domestic life, we have these images of people finding fulfillment in simple everyday activity, virtue in honest work. So the Rococo shows us that not everything is exactly the same, that the majority of it does center around these aristocratic patrons decorating their households. And on the one hand, we see the aristocrats themselves deeply engaged in amorous pursuits, usually in the out of doors, while servants work behind the scenes to keep that lifestyle going. And the picture buyers, the aristocrats, are interested in both scenes of themselves at play and scenes of their servants hard at work.